All right, I hope you're ready for chapter 8. The second they cut through the strap at his wrists, Gregor spun on his heels and stalked out of the door. He was livid at Rip Red and Marith for revealing his feelings for Luxa to Solivet. First of all, it was his own personal thing. No one's business but his own. Second, didn't they know Solivet would just use Luxa against him like she did everyone he heard about? Didn't they see how it would only give her more power to control him? And finally, what if Luxa found out? He had no idea how Luxa really felt about him. They had never talked about it or anything. Now someone would tell her, and the idea was just so embarrassing. He was ready to find Ares and head home, and a form brushed by him as he reached at the end of the hallway, and suddenly Rip Red was blocking his way. "Hold on, boy." Gregor had his sword out of his belt so fast it was a blur. "Move, now." Rip Red held up his paws in mock surprise. "Oh dear, is this where we fight to the death? I didn't expect it to be so soon." "Move, Rip Red," said Gregor, and swung at the rat, who dodged his blow, but still lost a few inches of a whisker on the right side. "Either I'm getting old or you're improving on that deal. Or you're improving a good deal," said Rip Red. "But I suggest you don't try that again." Gregor lifted his sword at the sword to slice the rat when a pair of strong arms caught his in some kind of headlock from behind. "Stop, Gregor. You do not understand what service he did you," Marith said. "Get off me, man," said Gregor, struggling to free himself. But Marith was too strong, and even though he was mad, Gregor could not have attacked him with his sword. He was actually far more hurt by Marith turning on him than Rip Red. Gregor had come to think of Marith as a friend. Not now, though. So he kept fighting until Marith flipped him over and pinned him to the ground. Then Rip Red climbed on top of him. Ugh, the rat had to weigh about 600 pounds, and exhaled shrimp breath in his face. "Just let us know when you're ready to listen." It didn't take long for Gregor to give up, since he could barely get any air in his lungs. Plus, Marith and Nerissa were looking over Rip Red's shoulder with such obvious concern that it was hard not to believe they were genuinely upset by his reaction. He forced his muscles to relax, which was not easy because the rager thing seemed to be with him all the time now, bubbling to the surface at any provocation, and even thought it came without effort. And even though it came without effort, he could not turn it off at will. What? He growled at them. "Gregor, we are sorry if we revealed anything of a private nature back there. But when Rip Red opened that door, I followed him immediately," said Marith. "We did not want you back in the dungeon." "I was doing all right," said Gregor sullenly. "After only 2 days. But Solivet had locked Hamnet up in that very cell for a full month because he crossed her at the War Council," said Nerissa. "No light, no human contact. He was not the same when he came out. Vicus was fighting at the fount. The council was completely under her control. There was there was no one of any power to intercede for Hamnet. To suffer this at his own mother's hands? Many of us think it contributed to his insanity at the Garden of Hesperides," said Marith. "And if she'd do that to Hamnet, do you think she'd be more lenient on some insubordinate overlander?" said Rip Red. "He was the apple of her eye, and she doesn't even like you." "I would have said the same as Rip Red and Marith had I been clever enough to think of it," said Nerissa. "Please, Gregor, know that we acted on your behalf." Gregor thought of a month in that cell. Even with his new echolocation skills, it would be unbearable. Poor Hamnet. Gregor remembered how agitated he had been in the jungle when Luxa had suggested his self-imposed exile from Regalia had been excessive, that he could have returned, at least to visit her. Hamnet had said, "No, I could never have left twice. You know how Solivet works. She would have had me leading an army again in no time." Was he thinking of that cell, and how Solivet would have not let him out of there until he was either completely insane or so desperate he'd do anything she said? It must have been awful for Hamnet to know in his dying moments that he had no choice but to send his son, Hazard, back to Regalia to live. Is that why he had extracted the promise from Luxa that she would never let Hazard be trained as a soldier? Gregor had always thought that Hamnet had made the request because he was so opposed to war in principle. Now he wondered if he had also said it to keep Hazard as far out of Solivet's hands as possible. Gregor could feel the tension leaving his muscles for real now as he began to understand his friend's motives. Still, what if Luxa found out what happened? No one will utter a word of what was said in that room. You may be sure of that, said Marith. We will not speak, and Solivet would not want it common knowledge. Okay, you did me a big favor. Now let me go, said Gregor. He still spoke gruffly, but he was not really angry anymore. Just when I was getting comfortable, said Ripred, giving a luxurious stretch that nearly crushed Gregor's ribs before he got off. Let's get down to the code room before that sister of yours drives the finest minds of the Underland completely nuts. Oh yeah, the code. He knew it was important, but I'm going to the hospital, protested Gregor. Please, Gregor, Luxa sleeps, so you would not be able to truly visit her, and we have real need of your help, said Nerissa. The exertion of the last hour had set her to trembling violently. He did not want her fainting or something. All right, Nerissa, I'll go there first, said Gregor. Marith had to return to Solivet's side, but Nerissa and Ripred accompanied Gregor to the code room. They gave him 10 minutes to run into a bathroom for a quick wash and change of clothes, and then hurried him up a few flights of stairs to the chamber of a long, narrow corridor. They walked in on quite a scene. Although he knew this was not its purpose, the rooms reminded Gregor of a zoo. It was shaped like an octagon. On one wall, the door was shut, through which Gregor had entered. The one directly across from this had a carving of some sort of strange tree. A table covered with scrolls, books, and long strips of white fabric was set up beneath the tree. The remaining 6 walls had arched openings of various heights that led to the private rooms. Above each arch was the name of a creature that was meant to inhabit the room: spinner, crawler, human, flyer, gnawer, nibbler. Some of the rooms were already filled with their designated guests, and this was what had given Gregor the impression of a zoo. A light green spider rested on a web. A heavily bandaged white mouse with black markings lay on a nest of blankets. A bat with creamy white fur hung upside down from a perch, and a roach peered out of the archway that was only 3 feet off the ground. Every arch was equipped with a curtain that could be easily closed, but at the moment all were open, because all of the creatures were staring fixedly at Boots. She was standing on the back of her loyal cockroach friend, Temp, smack in the middle of the octagon, singing the Itsy Bitsy Spider. Hey, Sorry, Klaus tried to lick my cup. Ew. Singing the Itsy Bitsy Spider at the top of her lungs. The green spider, to whom the song was principally directed, seemed to be cringing. Boots was somewhat off-key, but Gregor was pretty sure it was the loudness that was making the arachnid hunch down and contract. Spiders disliked any loud noises. As she wound up the song, Boots turned to each door and gave a separate bow, saying, thank you, although no one was applauding. Gregor knew she didn't care. As long as she had an audience, Boots could go on like this for hours. She has been going on like this for hours, whispered Nerissa. Days is more like it, said Ripred in disgust. You've got to get her to focus on the Code of Claw before the entire team bolts for home. Next, I will sing one for you, announced Boots, pointing at the bat, who actually flinched. Boots! Hey, Boots, what's going on? Said Gregor, trying not to laugh as he crossed to her. He thought it was funny, but it probably wasn't if you had been in the audience for days. Grego, said Boots, and put her arms up for a hug. Come here, you, said Gregor, lifting her up on his hip. How are you doing, Temp? Temp bobbled his antenna. One was still bent from an earlier encounter with rats. Well, I be well. I am singing to make them happy, said Boots. You sure are, said Gregor. You know what else would make them happy? What? Asked Boots, her eyes widening in anticipation. Gregor realized he didn't know. He looked back at Nerissa and Rip Red. What do you want her to do? Well, no one knows, do they, said Rip Red. She's supposed to be the key to breaking this whole code wide open. But all she's done so far is terrorize the rest of us into total submission. I've been singing, said Boots proudly. You certainly have, said Rip Red. Show him the ropes, would you, Nerissa? I'm not even meant to be here, Nerissa confided to Gregor as she led him over to the long table. But I volunteered to help with your sister. So this is your special code room? Asked Gregor. Yes, it was built a long time ago. We have broken many codes here in the past, and now we must unravel what we believe to be the code of Claw, said Nerissa. It is an unknown code that the Gnawers began to use the day we freed the Nibblers. So its appearance coincides with other events in the prophecy of time. This was a sample of it. She picked up one of the strips of white fabric and showed it to Gregor. It was covered with a series of lines. Some were straight up and down, others tilted to the right or left. It took only a short time to rule out any usual encryption methods the rats might have used. This is new and clever code that we must break. Gregor looked at the lines. They meant absolutely nothing. Well, if you're expecting Boots to start translating a bunch of chicken scratch into words, I don't think that's going to happen, Nerissa. She's just learning how to read. You do not need to worry about the lines. We have the messages written in letters as well, said the Bats, flipping off of his perch. Oh, forgive me, said Nerissa. This is Daedalus. The spinner is Reflex. The crawler is Min, and the nibbler is known as Heronian. Nerissa did not look at all well, but she kept going as she pressed the palm of her hand into her forehead. Perhaps you met her in the Firelands? No, I don't think so. Nice to meet you, everybody, said Gregor, and received a round of nods back. These are the finest code breakers of each species, said Nerissa. Boots is meant to represent the humans. And you represent the rats? Gregor asked Rip Red. Stop. Well, I wouldn't be anyone's first choice, but times being what they are, I'll have to do. It's not really essential that a rat be here, but a rat may help. Unfortunately, I have other pressing demands as well. Rip Red is wanted everywhere, in the war room, on the field, in the code room. He gives much insight into how the Gnawers compose their codes, said Nerissa, but he will not break this code. That is Boots's role. Daedalus snagged a white strip with his claw and gave it to Gregor. Stop. Shh. Sorry, I don't know if you can hear Klaus just whining for attention. Shh. I'm trying to read. You're being rude. Shh. Above the lines on this one were a stream of regular letters, but they didn't form any recognizable words. She may ignore the lines and only concentrate on the letters. Gregor shook his head. He hated to disappoint everybody, but he had to be honest. Listen, as I'm sure you know, this makes no sense, and I don't know what you think my 3-year-old sister can do with it, but I wouldn't set your hopes high. Boots took a strip of code and suddenly, excited, "Oh, I know! Gregor could feel the whole room in intense anticipation, hoping for some kind of breakthrough. But once she was on the ground, Boots simply tucked the end of the strip in the back of her pants and ran around. The fabric floated out behind her. Look, I have a tail. Gregor cracked up. He couldn't help it. The whole thing was ridiculous. Then Rip Red's nose was in Gregor's face. His lips curled back in displeasure. You may find this amusing, but if we don't crack this code, we lose the war. Period. Nothing you or I or anyone can do out on that field can compare with the power of knowing what is going on in our enemy's brains. So if you'd like your little sister to have a chance to continue her singing career, I suggest you help her focus. Gregor called Boots over, took off her tail, and settled her on his lap. He didn't know what they were doing, but he had her read the letters on the strip of fabric. She recognized them all. Sometimes a few actually form a little word like dog, and she would announce it with delight. But after they had read 3 strips, Boots had tired of the game, and so had Gregor. Is helping anything? He asked the group. No, perhaps when Vicus returns he may have some ideas, said Nerissa. In the meantime, we better proceed as if it is any code and do our best to break it, said Ripred. I have to get back to the war room, but I'll keep checking in. And with a flick of his tail, he was gone. Gregor, thank you. You need not stay. I imagine they will be waking Luxa soon for a meal, said Nerissa. Sorry I wasn't more help, said Gregor, and Gregor made for the door before anyone could think any other reason that he was valuable. He had no idea how to turn all of that gibberish into coherent words, though he had to see Luxa. Gregor sprinted into the hospital, but was not allowed to see her until he had taken another bath in some kind of antiseptic and dressed in sterile clothes and a mask. 5 minutes, said a doctor, who led him into a secluded room. The air was filled with a cool mist that puffed out of small tubes inserted in the walls. Luxa lay on the bed in a gown. Her face, neck, and arms, the areas that had been most exposed to the ash in the firelands, were a hot, painful red. Her breathing was still labored, and he could hear her wheeze each time she inhaled, but her eyes found his at once. Gregor crossed to the bedside. He didn't take her hand because he'd afraid he'd hurt her, but her fingers lifted and rested on his. She gave him one of her half-smiles and whispered, You stayed. He gave a shrug like it was no big deal, and at the moment it wasn't. He was too happy that she was alive, that he was alone with her at last, to think about what his decision to stay was costing him. He would have been completely content to stand just like that for 5 minutes, but in less than 1 the doctor returned and waved at him. Gregor stepped outside to object, but the doctor didn't give him a chance. Overlander, you are being called back to the code room. They said there is some sort of emergency with your sister. And that's the end of the chapter.